But I take two pictures, and I'm not an art historian, so I know I have to be careful with this, but I stack up Repin's, the Burlaki, the barge holders, with Bingham's pictures. In Bingham's pictures, these flatboat men, even though they're really on the periphery of society, they're very marginal figures. Because they're part of this emerging national narrative, they're seen as being very joyous on these boats, and there's this celebrating their individualism and their independence, whereas, of course, with Repin, you have a very different image of people. In both instances, though, I would say that the river plays a large role, whether it's oppressor or whether it's liberator. And I also would say in both instances, it's these two rivers that are part of this national narrative. And again, I'm careful. I have great respect for Donald Worster's work, but I wouldn't give the river exactly agency. I'd like to change the perspective, but I'm not saying the river itself is a historical actor, but I say there's a role, it's shaping, if you will, the history. The other piece of this, with comparing the visual images of both, in the United States, when in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, before you had this Bingham's work, you had the Mississippi River, there were these panoramas. And you had artists that went clear up to the northernmost reaches of this river, and they would float down the river. There was one panorama that was supposedly, I think this is exaggerated, but 4 miles long. I think that's exaggerated. But nevertheless, you had these artists that went clear up the northern reaches of the river, clear down to the end, and they did scene by scene of the river. These panoramas were seen by people in England, seen by people in Germany, seen by American audiences. It was very, very popular because it was celebrating this new country, and the Mississippi was the main attraction in this new country. Again, in the United States, what's very different is the Mississippi River was celebrated more through a popular culture. Even Bingham wasn't like Repin. He certainly he wasn't an artist on that level. He wasn't like Isaac Levitan on that level, but it was more of a popular audience. So but in many ways that contributed even more to the national narrative, because the number of people who saw this. So you had these panoramas, you had Bingham's work on the Mississippi, you had Mark Twain talking about the Mississippi, you had Longfellow doing a very famous poem that every school child memorized about the Mississippi. So again, my point is, from looking at the Mississippi, there was this rich visual and print culture that helped shape this national narrative, with the Mississippi being the center. The Volga, again, similarities. You have Repin's work, which has a different perspective, but you have Isaac Levitan, who spent his summers in the village of Plos painting the Volga. Very beautiful images of the Volga. And in what Levitan does, which I think is so significant, is in one of the pictures, I think it's a summer evening on the Volga, Levitan captures a lot of Russian symbols. He captures not only the Volga, but his sense of light and space. You have this boundlessness of the steppe. You have in the background the onion-shaped dome of the church. So you really have all these symbols at work, whereas the Volga, though, again, like the Mississippi, is what's cutting through the center of that image. And Levitan has other images, of course, of the Volga. You have other artists as well. But I would say, again, through this really rich visual culture, you see the beginning of this national narrative as well. And again, by the time I'm finished, please, if you have insights about this, I would really welcome them. While I've been working on this, I've been reading some other works, and one in particular who's really changing my way of looking at landscape and memory and how it shapes national culture is Simon Schama's book, Landscape and Memory. And what Schama sees, that I'm going to keep wrestling with in my book, is Schama sees a continuity, if you will, in that our landscapes, what's happening is that these primeval myths, these early ideas we have, are still with us. in that landscape and memory is still shaping us, and that we're not, in contrast to what a lot of environmentalists would say, that we've reached a point of degradation of the environment, we're alien to the environment. Shama says, no, there's this continuity that's going on, and that's something I'm hoping I can see in my work on the Volga and Mississippi. Well, with that set up for the 19th century and the visual culture that you see in the 19th century, I then move on, and what this article does a lot with, I go into an episode in each of the rivers' histories in the 1930s. And this is where I've had the most input from people in talking about the 1930s for each of the rivers, because there's a lot of scholarship in the United States, too, for this whole idea of development and modernity. But if you look at the development of the rivers, I think I can say it's fairly well established that these rivers are part of a national narrative by the time you reach the 20th century. But there's tensions as well with that national narrative. You have the artwork that celebrates the aesthetics of these rivers, whereas the rivers are always going to be there for utilitarian purposes. Both rivers have always served as highways, and every major river in the world, that's the case. The Nile, the Ganges, any. But you still have these tensions between the aesthetics and the utilitarian use of the river. In the 1930s, I contend that for both rivers, this tension gets it's very lopsided. In that in the 1930s, both of these rivers undergo massive transformations. And I'm just looking, because both are very large rivers, I just look at the upper Volga and I look at the upper Mississippi. Both rivers had very large locks and dams projects begun in the 1930s. Both of them were done under the name of modernity, progress, the economic benefit of the people. And if you read Joseph Stalin's words and you read David Lilienthal's words, you would think it was the same speechwriter, if you will. And that's what I find fascinating in part, is that for so long, when we've talked about 1930s United States and Russia, Soviet Union, we've talked about the differences. If you look at these two countries and just the transformation of resources, you're going to see similarities. And so before I get into talking a little bit about both of these projects, another theme I have is that, and that's what's in the article, is that this drive for modernization really overshadows everything. This drive to modernity overshadows everything. And James Scott, I don't know if any of you have read his book, Seeing Like a State. Yeah. I mean, I think Scott just hits it right on with that whole idea of high modernism. And I also would talk about Paul Josephson. Has anyone read his? Brute force technology, the same thing. I think they're really onto something. But for the United States in the 1930s and for Russia, they both, the United States I'll start with, begins this locks and dams project up in the upper Mississippi. I think it ends up being 9 locks and dams. And the reason that they do these locks and dams is part of a New Deal project. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the New Deal in the United States in the 1930s. It was a huge public works project in the 1930s. And for the farmers that lived along the Mississippi, they wanted this locks and dams because this is one difference between the United States and Russia at this time, because the freight trains were the only means of transportation for them to get their grain down to New Orleans. As a result, the freight trains charged exorbitant prices. So the farmers continued to lobby and ask for this locks and dams project to open up the northern part of the Mississippi so they could ship grain from Minneapolis all the way down. It was very successful in that economically it still is a boon. I mean, the barge traffic that goes down the Mississippi is still phenomenal. I mean, it certainly has paid for itself over and over again. I'm not saying environmentally it works, but from an economic standpoint it did. But what I'm interested in, not is just the project itself, but all the political rhetoric that was attached to this project and comparing it to the Moscow-Volga. Because for the upper Mississippi, they even had, just like Moscow-Volga had its own journal, for the upper Mississippi when they did this locks and dams, they had a journal called Old Man River. They had like 19,000 feet of photographs of this project, of each of these locks and dams being done. They had interviews with people. They had people, FDR came to it and talked about what a boon this was for the people there. It was compared to things like the TVA, which is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which again was another big project in the United States. But again, it was all couched that doing this project would be for the betterment of people, the economic promise that would come with this project. And it goes back to that idea of Scott, in that seeing modernity, modernization, as being a way to social progress for people as well. So again, the words were very similar, although I will say Lilienthal, who headed the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, he made a point every time of comparing what he did and the difference with the Soviet Union. Lilienthal continued to say that what we're doing, there's a moral, like a higher moral calling, in that we are expanding democracy by bringing these big projects, and that what the Americans were doing is very much different than what was happening in the Soviet Union. Although when you strip away that first layer, if you will, of the onion, the similarities are the same. They're both talking about improving people's lives through manipulating the resources, through transforming resources. The end result was economic benefits. And again, just like Scott talks about, the belief, this confidence in scientific and technological progress is shared by both. I mean, it's a common. And even though there's a nationalism going on, for example, in the Soviet Union, they were very, very proud that all the machinery that was used for the Moscow-Volga Canal was made in the Soviet Union. So let me get to that and then talk about some of the similarities, and I'd like to hear your comments as well. Now, in the United States, of course, one big difference, which I would be very remiss if I didn't mention, the labor that was used to build these locks and dams, of course, was not slave labor. In the Moscow-Volga Canal, they did use gulag labor from Dimitrov, and I have to mention that as well. But in the Soviet Union, once they start the Moscow-Volga Canal, same kind of culture in that you have photographs, you have this Gleb Kuhn is an artist who does, just some of his pictures are fantastic of this project. One that I always think about and I hope to include in the book is a picture called Two Dimitrovs. On one side you have the repose of this church, this rural setting. On the other side, you have all these symbols of progress, of electrification and what else this project is going to bring. So you have artists there. In the evening, you have cultural events for the workers that are working on this dam. You have all sorts of publications. I found a booklet in the United States that's just it's from 1939. It's in English, and it came out of the Foreign Service publications in the USSR, and it's about the Moscow-Volga Canal. I mean, so it's just the literature for this was very, very rich. And in both projects, the political rhetoric, it's very, very loaded for both projects. The Moscow-Volga Canal is a much prettier work than what you see in the upper Mississippi. I don't know if any of you have seen the different monuments. I mean, they're very attractive, what they did, and this was about the same time as the metro system, so there was a real attention to detail and to making these locks and dams as beautiful as they could. Also with the locks and dams, it did another major purpose. It wasn't just for navigation. It wasn't just for hydro. A big reason for the Moscow-Volga lock and dam was for bringing for drinking water for the city of Moscow because it was growing so much at that time. For both, the Moscow-Volga Canal has been very, very successful. I spend probably the last 10 years going to places on that canal, and the ships that go through it's very successful, just like the Mississippi's is. And in fact, the Mississippi's is so successful, you now have people lobbying for a 12-foot locks and dams. They want to double the size of the ships that can go up the Mississippi. So again, from an economic perspective, very, very successful. What's appealing to me on another level, too, which Christoph Mach and I have talked about as well, and there's a book by Warnke, who's a German historian, is you still have this tension with the aesthetics as well as the practical. You have these huge barges going up both rivers. These rivers have been changed from free-flowing rivers to a series of slack-water ponds. Yet, at the same time, people seem to be able to reconcile the aesthetics of these rivers. The Volga still Mother Volga. Mississippi is still, old man river. You have people swimming in both. You have people seeing these rivers as these kind of icons. Yet, at the same time, in the Mississippi, the wetlands have really disappeared. There's times in Mississippi the beaches are closed. We don't have this aesthetic at work. So, both though, I guess, in summing up some of my comments, both of the rivers certainly to me led the way for what became this modernity that was exported. If you look, and I won't, hopefully this will be a second word, but you look at what happened in the 1930s, and then after World War II, that was the model. 1950s, 1960s, you see the World Bank, you see all these other organizations. These big, large river projects became the model for modernity. Afghanistan, I hate to say it, but Afghanistan in the late 1950s, where they're growing the poppies, well, before they grew the poppies there, a big engineering firm in the United States built a project in the Helmand province. They completely disrupted the diversified agriculture that was there. This area got bombed a couple times by different countries. Now the land is only fit for poppies. And again, my point being is that this model, this kind of giganticism, this high modernism became exportable. And the 1930s is when you see, I think you see these ideas of modernity crystallized. A couple of areas that I'd love to hear from all of you. I'm trying to make some links. I've found Trotsky's comments about nature and about the machine and about how they can end up shaping the resources, transforming. I have plenty from the American side talking about transforming rivers, but I don't have as many equivalents. I know that modernity and industrialization, and I've been to a lot of hydro plants and see the murals with Lenin and electrification, but I don't have as much text, if you will, for that piece of the modernity piece. But I could go on, but I think I'm going to end. I'd like to hear some of your comments, or if you have questions. I'd love to hear where you think I could go in a different direction, or if I should go in a different direction.
Maybe I missed something in the very beginning, but my question is, during all these huge construction works, you have a lot of rhetoric of improvement of nature, improvement of economy, but do you have any rhetoric of improvement of people? You can be better man if you work digging this.
Oh, certainly. Certainly for Moscow-Volga, because that's when that whole culture, and there's an example, I can't think of his name, but an example of one person who did, outstripped everybody for laying bricks for one day. So that was certainly part of. Now for the U.S. side, actually there is the same thing, and I'm going back to the archives for the Mississippi, but Hoover Dam, for example, which was the precedent for some of this, same thing happened in that they were pressed to complete it in such a short amount of time that, again, there was that idea of doing more and more and more.
So you are conquering the river.
Definitely.
Prestigious work to work here, prestigious job.
Well, in the 1930s, though, in the United States, people were just so grateful for a job. I mean, the depression was so... But certainly in Hoover Dam, and that's good. I'll have to look at that more when I go to the last, because I would have included that in Hoover Dam, the idea that people were, and they were proud to be part of this greater experiment. So, that's a good point.
Okay, go.
Can I follow up on that point? You said how the Americans stressed that labour on the Mississippi dams and locks was free labour in democratic country, in contrast to that with the forced labourers on the Volga-Moscow canal. But since these labourers on the Mississippi dams were doing public works because they were unemployed,
Right.
I mean, there's a degree not of forced labour, but there's an element of they were forced because there was nothing else for them.
That's a really important point, and I will, because these were public works projects. And by the way, there were deaths. I mean, not the same, but there were accidents. These were not the safest working conditions, of course. And one place, 8 workers died, just from accidents. But that is something that I will explore more, because you're right. I mean, free labor in a sense, but not...
So from the Soviet side, was there propaganda saying that capitalism is so awful in America that they have to make the unemployed work on these big projects?
I don't know. I should look. Yeah. There is a difference about the tyranny of the machine, but I mean, that's... okay. That's a good...
Looking at contrasts and similarities, you see both. And presumably they were volunteers on the Moscow Volga.
You see what they...
There were people volunteering. It wasn't all forced labour.
And that's gotten to be a really... I'd be welcome any comments on that. That's gotten to be really kind of a landmine, because there's another scholar who wrote on the Moscow-Volga Canal, and her emphasis is more the Gulag part of it. And as all of you know, probably much better than I do, Stalin's work is undergoing, kind of its revision. And there's books like Magnitogorsk that talks about how the workers, it's a different perspective than what you had during the Cold War. So, yeah, that's something I'm going to have to look at as far as the volunteers as well.
No, actually, in the Soviet Union, it looks like, the party leader will tell you, you will be the volunteer. It's like this, that's how it works, actually. And if you will say, no, I will not, you will have a lot of problems, actually.
But still, in Kotkin's book on the magnetic mountain, I think he quite correctly stresses that there was a pull factor and a push factor. And you have to examine both of them.
That's exactly right. And what he found too is that there was there was a whole subculture there that people lived with. People were more in control of their environment than initially what was being written. So,
well, my question, I have to say that it stems mainly from my ignorance, but I've been wondering if we, but obviously the 1930s, this is the crucial decade in our case and presumably in the States, but I've been wondering what was happening in the 19th century in terms of changing the river, its flow and its economy, because what we know now from the German case, I think it's David Blackburn's book, Conquest of Nature, that the Rhine was dramatically reshaped in the 19th century. So I've been wondering to what extent, when we, for example, when we view the dance pictures and we have this kind of image of nature completely undisturbed and almost primeval, to what extent the river was actually primeval at that time?
Well, and two things. Actually, the Moscow-Volga Canal was first conceived of by Peter the Great. He thought of it before this was back in the 1700s. So those ideas were alive long before, and I suspect there were different, probably smaller diversion works. In the United States, I can say there was a lot of irrigation projects, or not just irrigation, but hydro navigation projects. I mean, you had the whole canal system with the Erie Canal in the early 1800s. So there was a lot, Panama Canals at the turn of the century. So, but the one thing that makes the 1930s unique is that for the Corps of Engineers that built this project, that was their golden age. And the technology was changing so fast that, for example, one of the gates, they had this, they call it tainter and something gates for this technology, that by the time the locks and dams were completed, I think it was 1938, that technology was obsolete. So, I mean, it did exist, but the 1930s seemed to be this time that everything was accelerated a little bit. So, but you are right. I mean, it was before. I mean, they were looking at diverting and getting Moscow access to the Caspian long before.
May I ask also a question? What I'm curious about is about the transport models. You are speaking about, you are trying to compare two models, yeah? US and Russian rivers and how they are developing and how images of them developing. There are only and how narratives, national narratives emerging and developing in that context. And you say that it is very transferable, and later many countries used it. And when you are thinking about that, it's just like a metaphor for you, or you are thinking of something else. How that happened? I mean, the process of transference.
Oh, transference.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's where Scott's work, I mean, along with others, in that I think you have this cadre of engineers and scientists who, I mean, they're all working in the same areas, if you will. I mean, there's a lot of big companies. Well, for example, in the late 1950s, one big company, Morrison Knudsen, big engineering firm, they were all over the world building projects. Is that what you mean, or is that, or am I beginning? But I mean, I think it was, and there's a lot of articles in environmental history these days that talk about, too, what happened in the 1950s, because this technology was in the hands of a few, you know, there was these engineers and these scientists, that they lost the local knowledge that was there. I mean, their prism was just the technology and the science, and they completely ignored. And in fact, there's some, Heather Hoag writes, and I'm getting a little off the subject, but I think it does fit. Heather Hoag writes about sub-Saharan Africa and their irrigation, not just irrigation, but hydro projects. And actually, she is rather defense in British imperialist, in that the engineers before you have, after World War II, the British that were there during the colonization times, they were more thoughtful about local knowledge, local customs, and how people saw the river and the resources than these engineers that come in and scientists after World War II. But it does seem to be that the community shrunk, if you will, and that they were all, this transforming the resources was in the hands of World Bank, USAID, and some other big. So, and I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that too, but yes.
So, at what point of time do you see the major change in terms of this, respect to local knowledge? Is it after World War II or even earlier?
Well, I would agree with. I mean, Heather Hoag makes a convincing case that imperialism was not a good thing, but they did respect the local knowledge. But I think what's happening today is the United Nations, particularly when you look at those Millennium Development Goals and UNESCO, particularly this group, the International Hydrological Program, they're spending a lot of time and energy working with NGOs to recapture this local knowledge. So I think now, but I think it's been recent.
So, but the beginning is after World War II. Not earlier.
Yeah, except for, I think that for a while, during imperialism, you did still have some recognition, but then that was when you have the age of the expert, I think that diminished for a while. So, but I think it's coming back. I hope.
But in Russia, my last project was a little bit connected with this topic. I just tried to look to the changes to those attitudes toward natural resources in a longer perspective from 18th century up to 20th century. And for the Russian history, I saw the First World War as one of the shift point when the state started to make large inventories of the resources of the country just for the state purpose. So they just excluded the local users, and the whole idea that the people would be mobilized to use the resources emerged from that time. So usually we located in a Soviet time, but I tried to argue that it started earlier because it's the same scientists then they, after the First World War, they began research on the Soviet. And especially in 20th, you can see the both, the both things. So it's this large state project, but also the interest to local knowledge with all this gravitating and all that kinds of things. And we're trying to educate the local users of resources. And from 30th, it's all mostly came under this, state invented.
But you didn't see that before then, before World War I, that started something? In
some case, so there were some also different layers before that, but in the second half of 19th century, but major shift during the period of the war.
I think that partly it goes back to the Petrine tradition, actually.
In a way, in
yes,
some
because in the 18th century documents you can easily find that ideas like, we have to do it like this, in this case, and the officials, and we do not need to ask the peasants because we have no one clever man among the peasants. So, like this.
But on the other hand, under Catherine the Great, all this, Russian expeditions of the Russian Academy, it was a very large interest to local knowledge.
Well, that's certainly one of the issues, for a global issue, I think. And even in United Arab Emirates, that's one of the things that they are most concerned about is losing. They used to have, and I know we're getting off the topic, but it does fit. They used to have in United Arab Emirates diversified agriculture, and now it's really monoculture, and they're losing. They have these qanat, they call them alphalage system there, but they are qanat. They're not using them this way that they were. All those different, ways of being sustainable are being lost. And now people, though, are trying to capture it before it's too late. So, okay, I do have a question. I'm hoping someone. I interviewed a history professor in Dubna, and he did not think the Volga was. He really did not equate the Volga as being a symbol of Russia. And he said if it is a symbol, it came rather late as a symbol. And I was surprised. I always thought of Mother Volga, Nekrasov, the whole, I don't know, but what?
Actually, no. Nekrasov is second half of the 19th century.
Well, that's
rather
true.
late, actually.
That is true. That's true. I'm sorry. Nekrasov would be late. But the whole idea of Mother Volga is rather a old.
It began to be constructed as cultural symbol from the very beginning of the 19th century.
The beginning of the 19th century.
Yes, I have a strong feeling that for the 18th century, Volga is a dangerous place where bad Kazakhs meet merchants and that stuff, but not the heart of Russia. The heart of Russia is Moscow or Novgorod, like this. But
But by the 19th century, I think you could say the Volga becomes part of.
Well, it's a good question when exactly it happens.
We have one explanation if you know read this alien paper. Christopher Alien, when he tried to explain how it was constructed. I don't know is it a completely true.
Well, he talked in the 1830s when the two were sent.
It's a little bit earlier.
But
It's earlier.
earlier.
Yeah.
Look, if I remember correctly, there was a project, Sasha, you must remember it, there was a project of actually painting the whole course of Upper Volga. I think it was sometime in the 1830s or 40s. And in fact, the very first reference to that project I encountered quite a number of years ago in Naukaya Жизнь. And later, but Ida in his book, Snigger Nature, he also refers to that project. And I think some parts of that massive painting, because basically two artists were dispatched on a barge along Volga to paint virtually everything what they observed while traveling this way. And apparently some parts of that picture are still, they're still housed in I guess in the Russian Museum.
Really?
If that was in the 1830s or 40s, because it must be the Nicholas I reign.
Eli described it in his paper.
He does. Чернышов, точно.
But it's still in the Russian Museum, but not where you can see it.
Not all of them, but
Yeah, some parts of the.
panorama.
Yeah, it's not exhibited, but they house at least parts of that painting.
Because you see, there were travelogues around the 1920s and a little bit earlier also, where they portrayed Volga River as probably not the symbol of Russia, but what is a very important place. It's Volga Matushka, it's something where Russian heart is. So it's the very the beginning of the 19th century.
And these are Russian
Travel,
travel
poetry, and literature. Yeah. It's earlier than Chernysov journey.
Okay.
Because when they sent Chernysov to paint it, they have already that idea and they had that there is something very important, and which is shared in public. I mean, it was not the idea of somebody; it was somewhat very important in public.
Remember this? Do you know this work of Gvida Hausman? He wrote a book about Volga, and there he divided, I think, the emphasis on Volga, and for Upper Volga he emphasized the church history. It's a very rich church history for Upper Volga region. It's a lot of old monasteries and sacred places in the Upper Volga.
Mythology.
Yeah, mythology, and he also told that it was some kind of revival in 19th century for this church history, and even the source of Volga was constructed as like a sacred place in a way, like religiously. So I think I didn't read the book because it's in German. My German
It was
is not good.
interpretation.
But I read one of his papers translated into Russian. Does he have the English paper?
Yeah, we have it, and you have it.
English?
Yeah, because he took it was 4 years ago, sometime there was a big conference on historical memory here in the European University, and he was invited, and he came and gave a very interesting paper on that. And now he's writing a book. We don't know, probably it will be on English or it will be German, and we don't know.
Maybe because he is in Ireland now, he moved to Dublin.
And what is the book on?
It's just coming. Probably it's not. It was not published yet, but it's coming.
But his German is a dissertation.
It's not a dissertation.
Yeah, if I can follow a little bit this issue about the sources of Volga, because I've been studying some educational journals intended for publicizing the idea of educational priests around the turn of the century. And that was really a rather fashionable topic, the idea to take students, primary school students, as guided to their sources of Volga. But actually it's quite funny to read their accounts there, because in a way the journey proved to be rather disappointing, because there was actually nothing to see there at the very sources, apart from a very modest kind of a chunk of them. But what is interesting to me, the way how all these guided tours were structured, I always thought that they were sort of modeled mainly by geologists, because the main point was to see the traces of the ice age there. And I think Arnochin's research trip to the watershed of Volga, the Western Двина and the Dnieper in the last years of the 20th century, the 19th century, the famous botanist and zoologist and anthropologist from Moscow State, Arnochin, who went there. I think it greatly influenced all these pedagogical ideas about the educational value of these trips, because I think before that it hadn't been a prominent topic.
And I did read Evie's book, the Meager Nature. So.
And I also would like to say that if you take first part of Volga from Tver to Yaroslavl, from Yaroslavl to Nizhny Novgorod, it was very important for people who lived at 14th, 15th century, and also we can remember about Novgorodian warrior, Novgorodские ушкуйники, who traveled travel by Volga and make
They used to rob people.
Yes, to rob some people from Gold Hoard, from Kazan, from Nizhny Novgorod.
And actually, for the 17th century and even for the 18th century, the Volga is the place where Tatar lives.
Yeah.
Where you go to, I'm going to Volga to have some nice things. Like in Russian, it sounds like Zipunada. Like I need some coats and I go to the Volga River. So just to become a Kazakh and to meet some merchants like that. And it needed some time to appropriate all this big river. In the 18th century, it still was recognized as a territory a bit out of the state control. So it is included into the Russian Empire, sure, but still it's too far from the center, and it is too hard to control all this huge area.
So the 19th, I mean, in a way, that's where I started with the 19th to 1800s. That probably is the best place to start for both rivers. So
there was also some similarity with Mississippi, because both are frontier rivers.
Yes.
So it's also the frontier boundary of Volga and Mississippi with different people's things.
well, and they both, I think I won't get into this very much, but just that tug with the aesthetics, because there is this book by Warnke who says every landscape is political. And he talks about the aesthetics, that even the aesthetics is saying something. But you also have in Mississippi these big, people go back now and take these paddle wheel trips. It's like a vacation. Just like on the Volga now, you see these huge ships that people, for recreational. So you have really what should be, to me, kind of dissimilar activities on the river. So, but...
Yes, and I have read very short, memoirs of a captain of a steamboat in the, I think it was late 19th century in the Volga downstream. Used to be a captain of ocean ships, seagoing ships, but something, he was unlucky. He did, and he became a captain of a small steamboat in the Volga River, but being a captain of ocean-going ships, it was boring for him, so he was writing memoirs. And the memoirs were that he was in the ocean, he didn't feel such a huge power of nature over his ship as it was on the Volga River, because in the ocean is always deep enough. You can find any way you like. But the Volga River rules your ship very much, because if it is not deep enough here, or the river somehow lost depth and you have to wait. So he describes as how they, are staying somewhere in the port for weeks waiting for the high water and drinking a lot of tea and vodka, and they have no way to go. They are waiting for the moment when Volga will let them to go. I mean, that's...
Well, if you can give me a citation, because that would be... I don't know how many of you read Richard White's book, The Organic Machine, but he talks about the Columbia River, and I can do a similar one with the Mississippi, in that they talk about before the Mississippi is dammed with locks and dams, about what to be a captain of a ship, a steamship in the Mississippi, takes great skill. You have to know where every sandbar is, where every twig, where every limb is and tree, and it's the same thing Richard White talks about the Columbia River, and how people, these early captains, really knew the river, knew it in a different sense. And it sounds like with the Volga, I mean, now it's these slack-water ponds. I mean, it's a very different river, the Mississippi and the Volga. But that historical reference to a time when the river, was more of an energy. I mean, there was an energy involved in it.
And he was shocked that he's a captain, but he has to invite his bearded peasants from the shore who explains him, the captain, explains him how to go here, because it's not enough to be a captain and have a good education somewhere in St. Petersburg, a big experience of crossing all the seas of the ocean. All this is useless on the Volga River.
So you need the local knowledge.
Yeah, sure.
Local knowledge again.
Sure.
If you can find the citation, I'd love to.
Yes.
That would be wonderful to have. I always learn more than what I think I provide. This has been wonderful.
May I ask one question more?
Yeah.
Probably not easy to answer it, but I'm curious about, it is a book, yeah? You're writing a book, and there are a lot of interesting perspectives, stories, and what would you think would be the most intensive, the most interesting to you? Technology, using the river, images, national narrative, what?
Well, and that's a good question, because when I did that article, you all know Don Worster, I asked him to look at it before I did the article, and what he wanted me to emphasize more was the technology. And I think I probably haven't quite sorted out yet. I mean, that's why I'm glad that we're having this conversation, in that I've always felt it's important, and people like Christoph Mach encourage that we're not doing enough comparative studies with rivers, But I guess I'm not sure yet where my main emphasis will be. So, and I'm sorry, I probably should know that answer, but I don't yet. And I'm still doing a lot of reading. I've got a few archive visits yet to go. So, I don't know.
But when you started giving your talk, I think you were quite explicit in emphasizing that you were going to write a book about visual culture and about narratives of nationalism, modernity, or whatever, through considering rivers. So I thought initially it was quite...
Well, it will be, but I guess, and I do, it will be, and it probably will be Rivers as Narrative, as the title. where, I'm glad you asked the question. I mean, if anybody has suggestions, I'd be very interested. Because when I did show Don the first article, he said, why don't you emphasize the technology more? That to him was kind of more the story. But there's a lot of work right now, and I'm being influenced by some of this recent scholarship. There's a lot of work about, particularly 1950s, and this whole idea of modernity. You know, that how that was so much more powerful than people realized. That whole, and that modernity, and so maybe part of this is, I think the personal does come into how you write. I mean, I grew up hearing about the Cold War, and I heard that was about ideology. Well, you know, you read this, I mean, when I'm reading, ideology has very little to do with it. And I think about, too, in the future, when my children, you know, when I'm gone and my children, the story's going to be about the environment. It's not going to be about political ideologies. It's going to be what's happening to our rivers, to our mountains, to our forests. I mean, that is going to be the story. And so, you know, I don't know. I feel bad I can't answer that.
May I focus you more?
Yes, please do. You're giving me a lot of food for thought.
Why you decided to choose them 2 rivers? Because you may do something else. I mean, there are a lot of rivers in Europe and in Russia also. And
well, I lived by the Mississippi. I lived by the Mississippi for 18 years. I taught at a college in Wisconsin, and before that, all my work had been on water in the West and irrigation. I mean, my whole life I've spent studying water, but it was just irrigation. So I lived by the Mississippi. And then, honestly, part of it was just I met a scientist. We were talking about rivers, and he said, you know, there's such a similarity. He's from Russia, between the Volga and Mississippi. So the more I began to explore, and in 1930s, then I saw similarities. But that's the reason. And you could do. But I did do another article that's not here, but for UNESCO. UNESCO's doing a big publication, 7-volume series on water and civilization. And in that one, I did take a lot of other rivers to do art in rivers. So I did the Nile, Ganges, and some others. But this, I saw the similarities between the two. That I can answer better.
We've been talking more about the 20th century, but if we go back to the 19th century, you already mentioned that, of course, both, as we know now from the same Christopher Eden, that in the 19th century in Russia, presumably in the States, there was the same problem of conceiving the national landscape as picturesque, trying to accommodate very different landscape into the to make it fit the framework defined by Western European ideas concerning beauty, the standards of picturesque. I've been wondering, can you trace and do you see any influence coming? I would suspect from Germany, because thinking about Western Europe, obviously it must have been Germany with the right standing for something quintessentially national. Because for England, I suppose, and for France, we can't say so much.
But the Thames, though, too, and there's been a lot of books about the Thames and the influence that's kind of a national symbol too. And it's interesting that there are a lot of river biographies coming out. So I think Germany, they just were ahead. I mean, I think they've done more with what's, particularly the Rhine, the Skyhawk book and others, but I think the other nations have the same.
Can we trace any influence? So to speak, the reception of the idea and attempts to transfer the standards of the description, the way you tackle the description of your own national river.
Well, not so much rivers, but I guess I would take the transfer of people like Claude, the painter, the landscape painter. I see his influence, that with landscape artists. And then in the United States, you had a big school called the Hudson River School of Art, and they are one of the first ones that just celebrated a river for landscape art that I think was influential. So. But I think Claude really started the whole idea of the picturesque. Although you do have a lot of English artists as well that did that. But this book by Warnke is good because he talks about, we like to think about these paintings, these landscape paintings, as being kind of celebrating the pastoral and the rural. And what he says, which was fascinating, is that actually many of these early landscape paintings are messages of political power. Like, for example, there's a very famous Italian, I can't think of the artist now, who has the Duke and the Duchess sitting at this table, and the landscape is framed. They're looking out on this landscape, and it's framed. Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, art historian looks at that because of the linear and the perspective. But Warnke looks at that and says that's a political statement because they, and even where they're sitting, they're raised, they're looking out, that's their land. I mean, and there's another thing too, you see boundaries. I mean, it's all very political now, and the whole idea even of boundaries is another way what landscape art is doing. And because boundaries, as you get into more recent times, and he even goes into Warnke, like in the Middle Ages, you know how people knew what the boundaries were, at least in England, in Germany. People would take their young children out to, say, stone or something on the land. They would tweak the child's ear because they believed that memory came through the ear and say, this is our boundary. Well, these traditions got lost in art. So landscape, in a sense, was a way of defining boundaries. And I think Warnke's onto something. I think landscape does have that political message as well. I don't know if that answers. I went a long way around.
More questions or comments?
Just a comment on you mentioned the Ilya Rapin. The Ilya Rapin painting Burlaki, where the image is of the barge haulers and the people. But I've been to the part of the area that takes place on the Volga where he painted it at Chimrayeva, which is on the Samarskaya Luka, the peninsula bit around Samara. And it's one of the most spectacular parts of the Volga. There's mountains on each side. They're not that high by world standards, but they're high by Volga standards. So it's spectacular scenery, but the scenery doesn't appear anywhere because the river is very sort of faint and faded in the background. So he chose deliberately to exclude the landscape from his painting.
Well, I agree, and I look, and again, it's interesting when you get into this because art historians, there's different, and I know part of that painting came out of the group. It was part of the Wanderers, but it was certainly the social realism. But the other thing that art historians talk about is, in a way, the landscape is there because of how he uses the light and the shade. In that he gives that sense of spaciousness, which I know it's not the definite, but there's that spaciousness that's there. So
space there, but it's not the landscape of where it was painted.
I am curious though, and I know I'm going out on a limb with this one, although I've talked about it at a couple of conferences. And I'll do more research before but stacking up this Bingham picture, juxtaposing that with Rippon's picture, because Rippon, these are people from the same substrata of society in a sense. These are the disenfranchised in both societies. And in America and the United States, these keelboatmen are really considered, they're always outside of civilization. They're never part of the cities and towns. They're always kind of part of that environment. And the Burlaki, what I've read, are often runaway serfs. They're not. So, but on the one, their experience, they do look disenfranchised, whereas in Bingham's, they're liberated, if you will, and part of that landscape. I don't know. I don't know if people have thoughts on that, but and how far we can go with that comparison.
So thank you very much.